On July 5th, 2021, I crested the top of a long uphill climb in Northern California and looked down at the valley below. Underneath me, I saw flames and smoke rising up slowly. Smoke had been building around me for the past 30 or 40 minutes, but I had chalked it up to one of the many fires I had been following in the area, safely 50 or 60 miles away. With no phone service, my partner many miles behind me, and no way to defend myself from fire, I felt helpless. There was only one thing to do. I turned and sprinted back down the way that I came. I'm a college student, originally from Maine, at a university in California studying economics. And last year, I hiked a little under 8,000 miles and slept outside about 300 days of the year. I'm going to tell you how, and arguably just as importantly, why I would do that. It all started in early 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning. I was sitting in my economics class, ready for a normal weekend of college, partying and such. But instead, I got a text message and a flurry of calls. I learned that one of my closest friends had just passed away from an overdose. In a matter of seconds, I felt like my whole life had changed. I descended almost literally into a cave of grief and insecurity. A normal response might have been to lean on family and go to therapy, but I just didn't know how to reach out for the help that I needed. What I did know how to do was go on long-ass runs and read books. So that's what I started doing. Feeling stagnant myself, I became enamored with the world's greatest explorers. Shackleton and his trans-Antarctic expedition, Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary's ascent of Mount Everest. Questions I had never considered before. Questions like, what did I want to do with this precious life that evidently was way more fleeting than I had ever considered it to be, suddenly wouldn't let me escape. In the midst of this existential questioning, I read a Facebook post. Somebody who was claiming to have hiked the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail, and Continental Divide Trail, all in under a year. The project dubbed the calendar year Triple Crown. I had two responses to this. First, I thought, this seems absolutely bonkers. How could anybody do this in 1 year? I learned that only 9 people had ever done it, less than the number of people who had stepped on the face of the moon. And nobody anywhere near my age group. My second response was, come on, I got to do this. It was just a matter of figuring out how. I became absolutely absorbed in this challenge. If I wasn't training, I was researching or working one of my 2 jobs to save money for gear and supplies. I recruited one of my buddies from college, my roommate Jackson, and we challenged each other like brothers. For the first time in many months, I felt the numbness dissipate within me, and in its place, a sense of purpose took over. I almost felt as though this idea of the Triple Crown was what I was living for. Of course, we were nervous. Neither of these 2 bright-eyed kids had ever hiked one of these trails before. We hadn't even hiked more than 500 miles. But this calculated risk kept us up at night and made us really excited to wake up in the morning. On January 1st, we touched the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail and began hiking northward, apprehension in our minds. On that first day, it rained 4 inches. You think there's a little bit of rain outside right now? It was an absolutely torrential downpour. When water finally seeped into my Gore-Tex shoes, which I had hoped would keep me dry, they wouldn't be dry again for 5 days. A nasty condition called trench foot, which I'm going to show you for about 1 second because it really is nasty, set in, and every time I took a step, it sent searing pain stimuli from my feet up to my brain. Okay, brace yourselves for about 1 second of a disgusting image. Okay, we're done. At the end of that first week, we were met with a challenge that I really thought might do us in. The Smoky Mountains. Though the trail through the Smokies is only about 70 miles or so, in the dead of winter, it's absolutely miserable. We were post-holing through 3 to 4 feet of snow the entire time, for miles on end. There wasn't a soul in sight in any direction. and temperatures ranged from 0 to 2 during the day. The second day in the Smokies, it got so cold that every water source we passed was frozen, so we were faced with a challenge. Either stop, try to melt snow for water, during which we could risk hypothermia ourselves, or keep going and try not to get too thirsty. We opted for the latter, and dehydration quickly turned into hallucinations. When I got in my tent that night, I looked outside the vestibule, and I thought I saw like a monkey dancing in the trees. A monkey in Tennessee in January. I was losing it. When we finally did get into a rhythm, every day would go kind of like this. Jackson and I would wake up first and give the other a little nudge. We'd put our gloves on and try to warm our hands for a few minutes. Then we'd get all our clothes on while still in our sleeping bags because it was just that cold. Pack up our sleeping bags in our tents and usually like scream in pain because the poles on our tent were so cold. Put our gloves back on and start hiking. Sometimes we hiked together, sometimes we hiked alone. Sometimes we talked, or if we had any battery in our phones, like listened to music. Sometimes we argued a lot. And sometimes we just hiked in silence and enjoyed the nature. Most of all, though, I just remember how I felt. Internalizing the loss that spawned this entire trek in an entirely new way. I hiked with tears streaming down my face and instantly freezing in the frigid air and wind. On other times, like this photo, I remember being flushed with euphoria like never before. We reached the top of a long string of climbs in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in this photo, and I remember actually crumpling to the ground, sort of in disbelief of not only what we had done, but also just how beautiful the view was and how lucky I felt to be there. This theme of extremes, highs and lows, followed us everywhere. We often saw sunsets and sunrises likely seen by no more than a handful of people ever, like this one. Or views like this double rainbow, when we saw nobody for 50 miles, 60 miles. This theme of extremes followed us as we transferred from the Appalachian to the Pacific Crest and the Continental Divide Trail. In the desert southwest of the CDT in New Mexico, for example, I started experiencing time in a completely different way. I would look at my watch thinking like 30 or 40 minutes had gone by, and only 3 or 4 had. I looked in every direction, and all I could see was sand for the entire day, and my partner's beautiful face. I got tired of that too. As time went on, we settled into this rhythm. Sometimes our days were filled with adventure, from facing down a charging bear, to running from a lightning storm in Colorado, to hiking late into the night when we were inevitably behind this insane schedule we were trying to keep. Far more adventure than I could fit in this short talk. Much of the time, though, it was just a daily grind. Waking up every single day, convincing ourselves it was possible to hike 30 miles, doing it, going to sleep, and then doing it again. Whereas our bodies first struggled to handle 20 miles without pain, eventually we could do 30 or even like 35 with relative ease. Struggle always seemed to find us one way or another, though. I reached a final low point in mid-August. I was waking up every morning with chills, stomach pain. I couldn't stomach any food, had absolutely no motivation to even get out of my sleeping bag. 2.5 to 3 weeks later, all the while still hiking, I figured out that I had giardia as well as a couple other nasty waterborne illnesses. Despite all these challenges, when I look back on the entire year, I'm always struck by the fact that we were relatively joyful and happy. We loved what we were doing. A quote from one of those books I was mentioning at the beginning comes to mind. In Shackleton's Endurance, it reads, "All mankind really needs to be happy is warmth and a full stomach." The only caveat I'd add is sometimes we had smiling faces even when we were cold and when we were a little bit hungry. So that brings us back to that fiery mountainside in Northern California. I took one look at the flames, attempted a deep breath that left me coughing and wheezing, and sprinted back down the way that I had come. When I say I accelerated, I mean, I sprinted at the speed of what felt to me like a Maserati. I had never gone that fast before. As fast as I was going, it seemed like the smoke clouds just kept catching up to me. And a fleeting thought crossed my mind. Burned alive in a forest fire instantly feels like the loneliest death I could imagine. So I did what any good millennial or Gen Z would do. I took out my phone and I started recording. I know this logic is a little bit flawed. Like, how was my phone going to make it out of a fire if I didn't? But recording into it made me feel a little bit less lonely. In that voice memo, I remember mentioning how happy I was to have the family, the friends, the people who have supported me throughout not only this journey, but my entire life leading up to that. I reflected on how happy I was to have a partner like mine, Jackson, how grateful I was to him in this journey, and how I didn't actually regret attempting the Triple Crown, regardless of what the outcome was going to be. So, spoiler alert, I got to the bottom and I escaped the flames. And I don't know how much I escaped the flames by. It might have been a few hours, might have been 6 hours, it might have been even a full day. I finally got back to the nearest road crossing, found my partner Jackson, and we were able to hitchhike into a town. First thing I did was get a beer. It was a really good beer. I sat, called my family, and just thought about how grateful I was and how uniquely alive I felt in that moment. A couple months later, on October 22nd, 2021, 292 days, 8,000 miles, and a lot of dirty, worn-out shoes later, we finished the calendar year Triple Crown, returning to that same stretch of trail where I had had to run from a fire, since at the time we had had to skip around it. When we finished the trek that day, we were talking to a reporter. Here's that photo, by the way. We were talking to a reporter. And she asked me, what does it feel like to break this record that you've now devoted almost 2 years to? And my response kind of perplexed myself. I said, I don't care. It was cool. It was really cool to break the record. But what mattered far more to me was this idea of what can happen when we embrace risk. When we attempt something improbable with every fiber of our being and what that can reveal about ourselves. 5 months later, this is what I'm still thinking about. I'm back on the linear path of work and school, but I know I'll diverge from it again. Frankly, now I want to do something perhaps even grander than the Triple Crown, using these same lessons to not just attempt something improbable, but something impossible. Thank you.